The morning Agnes Quaye walked into the Maple Street Farmers Market for what she believed would be an ordinary Saturday, she had no way of knowing that the day would be remembered by a city, or that the quiet woman who drove an unremarkable car and answered to no name the market's new security team had ever heard would arrive before the hour was out and rearrange everything. But before the wrongdoing, there was the morning itself, and Agnes had always believed that mornings deserved to be honored. She had risen at 6, as she always did, made herself a cup of strong tea in the blue enamel pot she had carried from Trinidad 34 years earlier, and sat for 20 minutes in the kitchen chair by the window, watching the October light move slowly across the fires, escapes of the building across the street. Her neighborhood in Scarborough was not what anyone would call glamorous. The streets were old and the sidewalks cracked unevenly, and in the summer the hydro lines sagged between the poles like tired conversations. But Agnes had lived in this particular flat for 26 years, and she had long ago decided that the measure of a place was not how it looked, but what it had held, and this flat had held everything that mattered to her. She dressed for church first, then the market, the way she had always done Saturdays. A coral blouse, beneath her good autumn coat, her hair pinned carefully the way her mother had taught her when she was young enough to stand still for it. She took the streetcar east, the same route she had taken every Saturday for 18 years, nodding at the driver she recognized by his glasses, and at the older Somali woman who boarded at the same stop every week and never said more than good morning, which Agnes had always found perfectly sufficient. The Maple Street Farmers Market was, at its heart, the kind of place that didn't look like much from the outside, but earned its reputation slowly. Through decades of the same faces returning for the same bread, the same honey, the same bundles of dried lavender that the elderly vendor near the entrance had been selling, since Agnes first discovered the place. Agnes knew the names of 17 vendors. She knew that Rosemary, who sold preserves and pickled vegetables from her small farm 2 hours east of the city, always saved Agnes a jar of her tomato chutney without being asked. She knew that Mr. Hernandez, who came with his nephew, grew his Roma tomatoes in a greenhouse because his joints couldn't handle the cold anymore, and that he would never admit this to anyone, but had told Agnes because she had been a nurse for 31 years, and he trusted her the way people trusted nurses, which is to say completely and immediately. She was not, by any visible measure, a woman of great consequence. She was 69 years old, slightly arthritic in her left hip, with the deliberate gait of someone who had learned to take care with the ground beneath her feet. She carried reusable bags that had been washed so many times the logos had faded. She wore no jewelry except her mother's gold earrings, small and unassuming, which she wore every single day of her life. She had retired 3 years earlier from the visiting nurse program at a community health center that had quietly named its volunteer recognition award after her without telling her until the ceremony, at which point she had looked so genuinely mortified that the executive director had apologized in a whisper, and she had told him there was nothing to apologize for except the fuss. People who passed Agnes Quaye on the sidewalk often didn't look twice, and she had always thought that was just fine. She did not know, as she moved through the October air toward the market that morning, that new management had installed a different security team 3 weeks earlier. She did not know that the property development company that now controlled the building had its eyes on a different demographic and a different market, that the word the regional director used in internal emails was repositioning, and that the man chosen to lead the new security operation had been told, without those exact words, but in terms that made the meaning clear, to begin moving the space toward a new kind of clientele. Troy Pelham was 31 years old and had been a security supervisor for less than 8 months. He was the kind of person who confused authority with instinct, and whose confidence operated in inverse proportion to how closely anyone examined it. He had sized up the Maple Street market on his first day, and decided, without much deliberation, what kind of space he intended it to become, and what kind of visitor he intended to discourage. His partner, Cody Finch, was 24 and had been at the job for 5 weeks, long enough to learn that Troy's approval required agreement, and that agreement required nothing more than silence and proximity. Agnes came through the entrance at 10:15, nodding at 2 vendors she recognized, pausing briefly to let a young father navigate a stroller through a narrow gap between tables. She made her way to Rosemary's stall first, the way she always did, and Rosemary smiled at the sight of her and reached beneath the table for the reserved jar before Agnes had said a word. It was at the honey stall, a newer vendor, a young man from Peterborough who kept bees on his family's property, where Troy first noticed her. She had picked up a small jar of late-season clover honey and was reading the label carefully, holding it at arm's length the way people do when they haven't yet admitted they need stronger glasses. She was not hurrying. She was not causing any difficulty. She was reading a label in a public market on a Saturday morning, the way people had been doing in that building for more than 2 decades. Troy crossed the floor to her in 7 steps. His expression was already formed before he arrived. "Ma'am." The word carried the particular flatness of someone who knew how to make a title feel like an accusation. "Are you purchasing that, or are you just handling the merchandise?" Agnes lowered the jar and looked at him without alarm. In 31 years of nursing, she had encountered more than enough frightened people performing authority, and she had learned that the most useful response was calm. "I'm reading the ingredients," she said, her voice even. "I have allergies. I always check before I buy." "Right." Troy did not soften. "The thing is, we have a policy here now about extended browsing. If you're not buying, we need to keep moving." Agnes set the jar down gently on the table. "I've been coming to this market every Saturday for 18 years, she said. She was not hostile. She was simply stating a fact, the way she might have stated a patient's blood pressure, accurately and without dramatic inflection. "I wasn't aware there was a new browsing policy." "There is," Troy said. Rosemary had come around from her table. "Troy," her voice was careful. "She's a regular. She's been coming here since before I started. She's not causing any trouble." "Ma'am, this doesn't involve you," Troy said without looking at her. Cody had materialized on Agnes's other side by then, which was not an accident. Agnes gathered her bag from her shoulder and moved to step past Troy toward the produce section. Troy's hand came out and caught the strap, not violently, not in a way that would look alarming in isolation, but with enough force that Agnes, whose left hip had been unreliable since a fall 2 winters ago, was pulled off balance, and the bag twisted, and the momentum was wrong, and she went down. The sound her knee made against the cobblestone was small. The sound that followed, the honey jar slipping from the young beekeeper's table and shattering against the floor, was louder. And for a moment, the Maple Street Market held its breath in the way that spaces do when something irreversible has just occurred in full view of everyone. Agnes was on the ground, her right palm pressed flat against the cold stone, a line of blood already appearing along the heel of her hand. Her bag had split at the seam. Her autumn coat had torn at the elbow. She was breathing carefully, steadily, the way she had been trained to breathe through pain, and she was looking up at Troy Pelham with an expression that contained no anger and no fear. And somehow, because of that, made the moment even harder for those watching than any other response could have. An older man near the bread stall took 2 full steps forward and then stopped, his hands pressing together in front of him, his face doing the complicated arithmetic of a person who knows what he wants to do and also knows what it will cost him. A young woman with a ponytail had her phone out. She was recording. She didn't lower it. Rosemary had her own phone in her hand and had already scrolled to a number she rarely used but had never deleted. A number she had been given 4 years ago by the woman who was the most important person in Agnes Quaye's life, who had said simply, without drama, "If anything ever happens to my mother when she's at the market, please call me first." She pressed call. Adeola Quaye was 39 minutes into a board meeting that had taken 6 weeks to arrange. 21 people around the table, 2 of them ministry officials, 3 of them flown in from Frankfurt, all of them present because Quaye Technologies was finalizing the kind of infrastructure partnership that gets written about in business journals and cited in press releases for years afterward. Adeola sat at the head of the table in a plain charcoal blazer, her notes in front of her, conducting the room with the particular precision of someone who had spent 20 years learning to read what every person in a space actually needed versus what they were saying they needed. Her phone was face down on the table. It vibrated. She glanced at it. Rosemary. She picked it up and stood without explanation, the way she always did when something mattered more than the room. In the corridor outside the boardroom, she listened to 37 seconds of Rosemary's voice before she said, "I'm coming. Don't let anyone move her." She did not go back in to apologize or explain. She handed her phone to her assistant and said 2 words, "Handle it." Then she was already walking toward the elevator. Later, when journalists asked what it was like to be Adeola Quaye in that car on the way to the market, she would deflect the question every time. She had no interest in describing it. But what happened inside that drive was this. She stopped being the woman who ran a company worth more than the GDP of several small nations. And she became instead a girl from a 1-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, whose mother had worked 3 consecutive double shifts so that Adeola could have a second-hand laptop for school, and who had never once asked her daughter for anything in return. She thought about the kitchen table where Agnes had sat at midnight reading nursing manuals while Adeola slept. She thought about the winter. Agnes had worn her old coat for 2 extra seasons so that Adeola could have a proper one for university. She thought about how Agnes still made the same rice and peas every Saturday because Adeola still came home every Sunday, and how Agnes never mentioned this as something she did for Adeola. She just did it, the way she did everything, without announcement. She thought about how Rosemary had never called before, not once, in 4 years. Her hands were tight on the steering wheel. She did not speed. She drove the way her mother had taught her, carefully and with attention to the road. Because Agnes had always said that careless driving was a failure of respect for everyone else on the street. But she pushed every amber light from yellow to the edge of red, and she found a parking spot she was fairly certain wasn't strictly legal, and she walked into the Maple Street Market at a pace that fell just short of a run. Agnes was sitting on a low stool that the beekeeper had brought from behind his table. Her palm was wrapped in a clean cloth that Rosemary had produced. She was speaking quietly to the older man from the bread stall, who had eventually crossed the floor and was crouching beside her, and she was telling him, it appeared, something that was making him nod slowly, with the expression of a person being told a truth he already knew. Adeola crossed the distance to her mother in seconds. She knelt on the cobblestone without caring what it did to her trousers, and put her hands gently on her mother's face, tilting it toward the light, checking her the way Agnes had once checked Adeola when she was feverish as a child. "Mama, look at me. Are you all right?" Agnes reached up and pressed Adeola's wrist with her uninjured hand. "I'm all right, sweetheart. My pride is more bruised than anything else." But Adeola had already seen the hand, and the coat, and the torn seam of the bag that had held Agnes's Saturday purchases for 18 years of mornings. She stood slowly. She turned. Troy Pelham was standing 8 feet away, and beside him was Officer Brandt, a city bylaw officer he had called in as reinforcement, who had arrived to find a situation that had already shifted several degrees past what he'd been briefed to expect. Troy's earlier certainty had curdled into something more vigilant, though he hadn't yet diagnosed the specific cause. There was something in the way the woman in the charcoal blazer moved. Not aggressive, not loud, but entirely without hesitation, that his instincts registered as a different category of problem. "Who took my mother off her feet?" Adeola asked. Her voice was level, Anyone who had ever been in a boardroom with her would have recognized the register. The voice she used when she had already decided what was going to happen and was giving the other side an opportunity to understand it before it did. Troy straightened his shoulders. "Ma'am, your mother was asked to comply with a posted market policy and became uncooperative. This is private property and—" "I didn't ask what the policy was," Adeola said. "I asked who put their hands on her." Officer Brandt stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain calm and allow the security team to—" Adeola took out her phone, pressed one contact, said nothing except a street address and the words, "Now please." There are 6 minutes that followed, which she never explained to anyone afterward. And the market crowd watched those 6 minutes in a silence, broken only by the sound of 2 children asking their parents what was happening, and the parents not having an answer. What arrived at the Maple Street Market at the end of those 6 minutes was not dramatic by the standards of cinema. There were no flashing lights, no convoy of vehicles, no uniforms. There were 4 people in dark wool coats who walked through the market entrance with the unhurried efficiency of individuals who billed by the hour and chose their hours carefully. The man at the front was 62 years old, silver-haired, and had spent 30 years as a senior partner at one of the most respected civil litigation firms in the country. Beside him was the firm's managing director. Behind them, 2 associates were already taking notes. They did not address Troy. They did not address Officer Brandt. They stood to one side while Adeola spoke to them in a voice too low for anyone else to hear, and then the senior partner turned to the bylaw officer with the expression of someone who found the situation regrettable but entirely manageable. "My client is Agnes Quaye," he said not unkindly. "I'd encourage you to relay that name to whoever you feel is appropriate before the next 10 minutes elapse." It took Officer Brandt 4 minutes to call his supervisor. It took his supervisor 6 minutes to call the property management company's regional office. It took the regional office 90 seconds after that to determine, in a call that apparently featured several long silences, that the woman in the charcoal blazer who drove an unremarkable car and whose mother liked the honey at the Maple Street Market was, in fact, the single largest private shareholder in the development company that owned the building. She had bought the shares 4 years earlier, quietly, through a holding structure that pointed to a numbered company, that pointed to a trust. She'd done it. She would confirm to one journalist who pressed her once, and only once, because the market had been in her mother's neighborhood for 22 years, and she had seen what happened to places like this when the wrong investors got interested in the land beneath them. She had never exercised a shareholder's influence over the market's operations. Not once, until now. The regional director arrived at the market within 20 minutes, having left a fundraiser without finishing his drink. He looked, when he walked through the entrance, like a man who had rehearsed an apology in the car and forgotten the words. Troy Pelham was suspended before the hour was out, Cody Finch alongside him. A formal complaint was filed regarding Officer Brandt with the city's oversight body. The management company issued a statement, carefully worded, deeply inadequate, within 2 hours, by which time the video the young woman with the ponytail had recorded had been shared so many times it had reached people in cities Agnes had never been to, and likely never would go. But Adeola was not interested in the statement. She was interested in something Agnes had pointed out quietly while they waited. Agnes, sitting on her stool, with the composure of a woman who had already decided how she was going to feel about this, and had chosen something more durable than rage. "Rosemary told me they're tripling her lease," Agnes said. "Effective January, and the man with the tomatoes, Mr. Hernandez, got the same notice. So did the woman with the lavender. Daria, she's 81 years old." Agnes paused. "They've been here longer than most of the people who manage this building have been alive." Adeola looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she looked around the market. At Rosemary, speaking in a low voice to 2 other vendors, all of them with the same careful expression of people trying to determine whether this was the end of something or not. She stood, walked to Rosemary, asked to see the notice. There was a press gathering 3 days later. Not a press conference, Adeola made clear, because she had no interest in performing accountability. It was a brief statement at the market's entrance, and the only reason she agreed to it at all was because Agnes asked her to, and Agnes said, "People need to see that what happened here didn't just get tidied away behind closed doors." So Adeola stood at a microphone and said what she had to say in the most direct language she knew, which was not very dramatic. She said that the security personnel had been dismissed and the matter referred for further review. She said a new community oversight structure would be established. She said that the leases of all 17 long-term vendors would be protected for the next 10 years at fixed rates. Then she stopped talking, because she had said everything she intended to say. It was Agnes who surprised the room. She had not planned to speak. She had been standing to the side in her coral blouse, with her arm linked through the arm of the older man from the bread stall, who had introduced himself properly that afternoon as Alphonse, and who had turned out to have known her late cousin from church some years back, which Agnes had found enormously satisfying as a piece of information. But someone near the back called out, "Mrs. Quaye, how do you feel about what happened to you?" Agnes looked at the crowd for a moment. Then she stepped forward without ceremony and spoke into the microphone with the same matter-of-fact clarity she had used, with frightened patience for 3 decades. "I feel fine," she said. "My hand is healing. My hip is sore, but it has been sore since 2021, and I manage." The crowd laughed, briefly, and Agnes waited for it to settle. "What I want to say is this. I did not come here to talk about what happened to me. I am 69 years old and I have encountered far worse than this, and I am still standing, which I think says everything that needs saying." She paused. "What I want to talk about is Rosemary, who has been selling her preserves at this market for 22 years and who should not have to be afraid for her livelihood because a building changed hands. And the man with the tomatoes, and Daria with the lavender, who is 81 years old and has nowhere else she'd rather be on a Saturday morning." Agnes looked slowly across the crowd. "A neighborhood is not a building. Not a building. It is the people who keep showing up. And if we want it to stay a neighborhood, we have to protect the people who do that. That's all I wanted to say." She stepped back. Alphonse patted her arm. Rosemary was crying, though she'd insist afterward it was the cold. What followed in the weeks after was practical rather than dramatic, which was how Adeola had always preferred things to be. The Community Oversight Board was established with a genuine mandate and genuine authority. Adeola offered the chair position to Agnes, who declined immediately and suggested instead that the ceramics vendor, a young Somali-Canadian woman named Rama, who was 23 years old and had been at the market for 8 months, should be the one to lead it, because the board needed someone with decades ahead of her, not behind. When Rama was approached, she said she didn't know how to chair a board. Agnes told her she didn't need to know how. She just needed to know the neighborhood. "That you already have," Agnes said. "The rest is only paperwork." On the Saturday 4 weeks after the incident, Agnes took the same streetcar east, nodded at the same driver, and walked into the Maple Street Market at 10:15. Rosemary had her tomato chutney waiting beneath the table. Mr. Hernandez had saved her the best of the late-season Romas. Daria pressed a small dried bundle of lavender into her hands without charging her, which she did every 3rd week, and which Agnes always protested and always accepted. Alphonse was near the bread stall. He waved his hat. Agnes waved back. She did not stay quite as long as usual, because Adeola was coming for dinner, and she wanted the rice and beans to be ready by the time she arrived. She caught the streetcar home, her reusable bags full, her good coat buttoned against the November air, her mother's gold earrings catching the flat gray light of a Toronto autumn. Adeola arrived at 5:30, as she usually did on Sundays, and lately on Saturdays too. She brought nothing, as she always did, because Agnes had told her long ago that bringing things was just a way of feeling useful when what was actually useful was being present. She set the table while Agnes finished the plantain, and they ate together at the kitchen table that had been the fixed center of both their lives, for as long as either of them could really remember. After dinner, Agnes washed the dishes and Adeola dried them, the way they had divided the task since Adeola was tall enough to reach the drying rack. Neither felt the need to revisit the month just past. The oversight board was meeting. Rosemary had signed her new lease and had cried on the phone to Agnes for 7 minutes. The legal proceedings were moving through their appropriate channels at their appropriate pace. Eventually, as the November dark settled fully against the kitchen window and the lamp above the table cast its usual warm and insufficient light, Agnes said, "You left that meeting." "Yes," Adeola said. "Was it important?" "It worked out," Adeola said. "Things like that usually do." Agnes handed her the last pot. "I don't need rescuing, you know," she said quietly. "I was managing." "I know you were," Adeola said. "I just want to make sure you know that." Adeola set the pot on the shelf where it had always lived and turned to look at her mother, who was 76 centimeters tall and had raised a daughter alone on a nurse's salary and had held the hands of more dying people than most of us will ever meet and had never once, in Adeola's entire memory, asked for more than she absolutely needed. "Mama," she said, "you worked 3 doubles in a row so I could have a laptop for school. You wore that coat for 2 extra winters. You never asked me for a single thing." "That's not how love keeps score," Agnes said. "No," Adeola agreed, "but it's how I keep mine." Agnes looked at her daughter for a long moment, the way she looked at her when she was deciding whether to say something more or to let it settle where it had landed. Then she reached up and pressed her uninjured palm flat against Adeola's cheek, the way she had done when Adeola was young and running a fever and frightened, a gesture that had lost none of its power across 40 years and never would. "You were always going to be all right," Agnes said softly. "I just needed you to know it before the world did." The lamp above the kitchen table hummed quietly in the way old lamps do. Outside, the November street was doing what November streets in Scarborough do, settling into the particular stillness of a city preparing for winter, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but simply patient. Inside, in the kitchen that had held everything that mattered, a daughter put the last pot away and a mother turned on the kettle, and neither of them said anything more that needed saying, because some things have always been understood between people who have spent a lifetime choosing to show up for each other. And between this mother and this daughter, the showing up had never once required an explanation.